Hey, friend, welcome back to She Said podcast. I'm Laura Cox Kaplan. How far would you go to save your child's life? Would you teach yourself an entirely new field? Would you convince the world's top scientists to join your cause? Would you turn your family's crisis into a movement? Today's guest is the incredibly inspiring Nina Frost, who has done all of that and much more. When her sweet daughter Annabel was first diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder, Nina didn't just accept that prognosis. She actually built an incredible organization. She rallied Harvard research scientists, and she co-authored research that's changing what's possible for thousands of rare diseases. This conversation today is about Nina's story, but it's also about how she discovered her purpose, how she stays grounded, how she finds gratitude in those really small moments, and how she leads with purpose when there's no roadmap and when the road ahead is very uncertain. If this episode moves you, friend, please follow, rate, and share it. And also be sure to check out Nina's wonderful organization, Rare Hope. I've included a link in the show notes where you can find her. For now, though, here is my conversation with the incredibly inspiring Nina Frost. Enjoy. Nina, welcome to She Said, She Said.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Well, I'm really happy to have you. Your story is such an inspiration. And I'd love for you to start with that. Tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
So my role in this world, I find is to create a new way to think about treating rare neurological conditions collectively. And this has been a mission that's evolved and a kind of job description that I've created for myself over the years. And it's really kind of exciting to be in a place where I have found a mission and a way to execute on that mission. And I can kind of see the impact that our work is doing in real time.
Yeah.
You know,
How did you get started with this? Tell me about your daughter, because this really kind of propelled you into this work in a way that you had never anticipated, that most people would never anticipate. So take us back to what actually happened and how you got started in this.
So I think every parent has that same experience when they hold their child for the first time. And they look at their baby and they think about what the future has in store for them as a family, for this child who is just starting a life. And you imagine what that life is going to look like. And we had that moment. But we also, at that moment, Annabel was having a neurological episode. And we weren't aware enough to recognize that it was happening. But even within the first moments of her life, she was already having very severe neurological symptoms. And so, of course, that changes everything. The first 3, 4, 5 months of her life were ambulance trips, troubling symptoms. We thought they were seizures. We thought they might be a brain tumor. We could see over time, we recognized that there was something that was very clearly wrong, but we didn't know what it was. And it was terribly scary. And when a baby is so small and so vulnerable, I mean, the number of times that we had to call an ambulance and, be whisked away to the hospital and admitted. And, we spent many hard hours kind of grappling with an uncertain future and very little idea of what to do next. And so we lived in this kind of limbo for 2 years. And then after 2 years, we kind of stumbled into a diagnosis in a way that was fortuitous and kind of just a lucky chance. We saw a really wonderful neurologist in Boston. His name is Phil Pearl. He used to work at Children's here in DC, and then he moved to Boston Children's. And we happened to have an appointment with him, and he happened to have been at a conference for this very rare condition called alternating hemiplegia of childhood, and he happened to have been there the previous week. And so as we described Annabelle's symptoms, he thought, this sounds strikingly familiar. And he set her up with an EEG where she could wear it for 3-4 days at home. Because, typically you wear an EEG, you're in the hospital. If they don't capture something in 20 minutes, there's kind of no answer. So she wore it. We found, hey, she's having seizures and they're on this EEG. We're going to finally have some answers. We kind of came back and said, I think we have an answer.
Mm.
We've got to have found something. And what he saw in the EEG wasn't actually seizure activity. It was a different kind of neurological event that didn't quite qualify as epileptic. And I think for him, that was the confirmation that Annabel did, in fact, have this very rare condition.
Mm.
And hearing that diagnosis and understanding what that looked like was almost harder than not having a diagnosis, because we were
Mm.
finally able to look at what Annabelle's future was going to look like. And there was another family that we know very well now in Iceland, and they have a beautiful daughter who's in her early 20s now, and her name is Suna. And we saw this video that they'd made, a beautiful documentary called Human Time Bombs. And in it, Suna, their daughter, is having these horrible storms of dystonia where she's screaming in pain. Her muscles are contracting uncontrollably. Her parents can't do anything to help her. There are ambulances, there's tears. It was the most kind of traumatic introduction to this disorder, but it looked so familiar that it resonated so profoundly with us that this is, in fact, what Annabelle has. And her
Mm.
life is going to be very different than we expected.
Oh, wow. Wow. How did you deal with that, Nina? In that moment where you reached that conclusion, which is devastating, I'm sure. How did you deal with that?
It was a gut punch. I mean, I would have, and I say this all the time, I would have been happy to get in my bed, put the covers over my head, maybe grab my baby and snuggle her while doing it. But it was a real gut punch. And my husband, Simon, had a very different reaction. He said, I'm going to find out everything there is to know.
Mm.
And so he's, reading papers 20 hours a day. I'm kind of caring for Annabelle because the care component was also significant. I didn't trust any caregivers at that point. But kind of gradually, we both came back to this point where we could be empowered to do something. So we started a foundation, Hope for Annabelle, and we started that in 2017, 2018. We had a big fundraiser in 2019, which I organized with, a great team here in DC. And Simon kind of kept working on the scientific pieces. And over the years that evolved, he, had other professional obligations and I didn't. And it was very easy for me to kind of take over the path that he'd started
Mhm.
and expand on that kind of really great foundation that he laid of really understanding the science so that we could make decisions that could really direct where research was going and where we could invest our resources to really kind of maximize their power.
Yeah. We talk a lot on this podcast about influence and how oftentimes influence is something that it doesn't come with a title or with a job. It's something that you build through your credibility, through the trust that you develop with individuals, with the community that you build, all these sorts of things. Maybe talk a little bit about how you think about this idea of influence, and in particular, without a medical background and without what this sounds so incredibly complex. You're not dealing with something that's easy. This is super complicated, right? How did you take what you knew how to do and create influence with people that you were going to get, people in the scientific world, in the medical field, to join with you to work on this cause?
Well, first we had, there was an imperative, right? Like we had no choice and we saw no limits. I think those are the two kind of foundational pieces. But we also realized, and I think this is very much my personality, that I would like some level of expertise before I start talking.
Mm.
For me, there is no shortcut for doing some of that hard work where you're kind of understanding the background and that you're putting in the hours and hours that takes you to be able to speak confidently, to make decisions. So that hard work piece for sure. Professionally, my background's in management consulting, which is a different background, but it's actually really well suited to what I'm doing now. I am taking, as I did it in my past life, I am establishing a level of expertise sufficient to make directions, judgment, understand where gaps are, connect teams, put the pieces together. So in that way, my past life actually really set me up quite well for making sense of the many things that we're handling. Because I think that's the other thing to say. When we started on this path, we said, what is the highest probability of success? What kind of therapy should we build for Annabelle? And we thought gene therapy, that's what we're going to do. And, as we developed a program, we tested it in mice, we still have it on the shelf, but actually we discovered over time that we can't just pursue one thing. We have to pursue multiple paths in parallel. We've got to, mitigate any risks that things aren't going to work. And there's
Right.
so many other therapeutic modalities that offer some real promise for us. So what our strategy has been to invest kind of early on in multiple different lanes, which means that we are now managing more than 24 programs. So to
Mm.
go from nothing to this much more broad set of, programs and initiatives that we've developed, that we are project managing, that we are treating kind of like a strategic investment portfolio. That I think has been where I think of it in that way because of my background. But I will
Right.
say that my education is not at all suited for this. So this is kind of one of my fun party tricks that I tell people at cocktail parties when they ask, how my background suits me to this, because my educational background is completely like off topic. So my husband and I met at Cambridge University in the UK, and we were grad students, and his degree was in economics, and mine, I can say this without undue modesty, but I was at one time one of the world's foremost experts in masculinity in 17th century Bermuda.
Oh,
Of all the obscure topics in this
wow.
world to set me up for my current life, that was one of them.
Have you found any way of using what you learned in that? Because
None whatsoever.
none
None
whatsoever.
whatsoever.
Oftentimes I hear these stories and someone will say something that is so surprising like that, and they'll say, "But did you know that there's a connection here?" But in your case, not at
No
all.
connection whatsoever.
What led you to study that particular field?
I was a graduate student, and you want to pick something that hasn't been done before so that when you're trying to publish your manuscript or even just put your work together, that you have novelty. And so
Right.
this was a novel topic. I wanted to do something early colonial, and so that was, and I spent a lot of time in Bermuda as a kid. So it was something that I was interested in, and I thought this is a fun lane. So it was
Yeah.
fun.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, when you think about taking on a topic that someone has not sort of tackled before and you're digging into new information and clearly weren't afraid of new information or, you were not afraid of uncharted territory. When I think about that and the parallel to what you're dealing with now of pursuing something that really it's so rare and so unusual and you're tackling these really challenging obstacles, there is kind of a parallel when you think about it, potentially. I don't know if you see it that way, but it's kind of interesting to think about, your willingness to really dive in and not be afraid of what you don't know, right?
I mean, I think that's true. And maybe the analogy goes even deeper to the shipwreck in Bermuda in 1608 when, they shipwreck and they have to create something out of nothing, which is very much, along the lines of what happened to us.
Right.
With Annabelle's diagnosis, there was no infrastructure. There was no roadmap. There was no plan for how to advance this. This is not a situation where your child might be diagnosed with some horrible pediatric cancer where it may be rare and they might not know exactly the best, combination of treatments to try. They have possibilities. In our case, there was nothing.
Right.
Absolutely nothing.
Wow. Talk a little bit about how you've rallied your community to support your cause. You started raising money for this a number of years ago. I'm not sure how long ago you actually formalized the structure, but maybe talk a little bit about how you got started and any advice for someone who's facing some, major challenge where they want to turn this into their purpose and they want to, bring their community together. Maybe advice for doing that.
I think the fundraising piece is just absolutely essential, and it's frankly not my favorite piece. I like the kind of managing the projects and connecting people and developing the science, and I don't love the fundraising piece of it. And actually, we were very lucky that we raised enough money in 2019 that we kind of could take our foot off the accelerator for fundraising and focus on the actual kind of impactful use of those funds, but I think part of influence is money, and having an amount of money that we'd raised, I think, was really useful. And interestingly, it wasn't in deploying the money that we'd raised, it was in having it. And I think
Oh,
that over the years, as we connected with really, field leading scientists, and we developed very strategic relationships with best in field scientists, people like David Liu, who, invented the base editing technique that rescued baby KJ. Like our project with him is kind of in this similar category of just groundbreaking science, but we're working with these wonderful people. And because we've been assembling different resources, we've been assembling animal models, we've been assembling all these different tools that can be used by researchers, we've actually found that we haven't had to spend our money, that we've been approached by all kinds of people who want to develop a capability and they need a patient population to do it in. So they partner with us. Or we've been able to partner with other organizations who are also interested in kind of advancing things similarly. So we've been able to deploy much, much more, many times more funding. We've been able to control kind of where that funding is going in a way that we actually haven't had to open our wallet as much as you'd expect, which has been really interesting, because I think there's an understanding in the rare disease world that, funds are limited. And so people try to kind of bypass the burdening of organizations like mine, which has really been useful to our purposes and has allowed us to fundraise across so many things. And the other thing that is now a bit under there's a pall and some uncertainty, but what we've tried to do is kind of provide seed funding, incubator funding for scientists who want to get to a point where they can apply for a bigger grant, whether it's an NIH grant, whether we've won a CZI grant for $2 million for the gene editing project, where we provide the initial funding, we get the proof of concept data established, and then that kind of unlocks the next step for Trailblazer program. I think that's been the key, is that we have been, as a Trailblazer community, as a Trailblazer organization, with all of these, really kind of leading edge, on the frontier of science program, that we are able to kind of benefit from other funding sources than we might otherwise be able to.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. Maybe talk a little bit about, I know that your collaboration with Dr. David Liu, which you just mentioned, is really pretty extraordinary. Maybe talk a little bit about what that looks like and what makes that so extraordinary.
So yes, we've been working with David and his team for, I think, almost 5 years now, which has been really remarkable. We, I think in 2021, maybe 22, he published a paper on a gene editing rescue of a condition called progeria, which many people have heard of. There's a beautiful documentary called I Am Sam that was made by a wonderful woman named Leslie Gordon, who leads a lot of the research for progeria. And so it's one of those disorders that's rare, but is still kind of in the mainstream understanding of what these things look like. And so they published this really compelling rescue in mice. And we thought, this is something that we need to do. And it was this, first of its kind study that had been with this amazing scientist who already, many years ago was well established as, the kind of scientist who could win a Nobel Prize, could, a real top echelon scientist kind of person. And so we made a case to him that our disease was well suited towards his technologies. And actually, what they've done for our condition is novel in a couple ways. There's a different editing strategy called prime editing that allows substitutions of more nucleotides than the base editing strategy that they'd used previously. It is the first neurological condition to be rescued in a mouse model, so that also is another element of the novelty. And we were included as a kind of peer partner through the CZI grant, where we were co-PIs, through the full range of experiments, where at each step of the way we're discussing experiments with the collaborators at the Jackson Lab, who are also just part of this team and wonderful, wonderful partners as well. So the three of us were kind of instrumental in making decisions along the way in a way that's really quite extraordinary for a non-science background organization. And I say that, and I have a science advisor who we've known for, as long as we've even known about Annabel, longer than we've had a foundation. And she has, she has an NIH background. She's I don't want to say that without a science background, because in fact we do have kind of that more profound science expertise in our world as well. So
Right.
we've been real, I I think that the Lou Lab has let us kind of be part of advancing this project because we are representing patient interests. And I think that's the other thing that's been really useful for us as a tool, is that we are not representing patients because we have opinions about what patient families might feel. We've actually spent a lot of time and energy surveying patient families, understanding what symptoms are burdensome, understanding what their experience looks like. And that allows us to represent this bigger group with some authority, right? This is not my opinion. This is data that is analyzed. And now I am using that analysis to represent this population really carefully.
Yeah, this is what's been referred to as a patients as partners approach, right? Am I getting that right? And that's really that's cutting edge. That a lot of people are not doing that. Maybe can you dig into that a little bit more? Because I would imagine from your firsthand experience, that was really something that you felt passionately about. So maybe talk a little bit about that for our audience who, you know. Probably has not had a similar experience and has not sort of walked the walk that you've walked. So help them understand why that was so critical.
Well, so science is a series of decisions. There is no kind of ideal path without making a number of different decisions along the way. And each of those decisions can have a real impact down the road, whether you're focused too heavily on mechanistic science that's interesting rather than, impactful for patients, for instance. There's a whole spectrum of decisions about how to allocate funds, how to either do an extra experiment to really confirm something, or how to move forward without like perfect experimental conditions. And there are balances and, compromises and decisions that are made constantly every week. And by being part of the discussion of those decisions, I think we found that we could be really helpful. We could say, this is what's important to patients. These symptoms, patients are in our world are disabled, but then they occasionally have these kind of storms of symptoms where they are overcome with either dystonia, where their muscles cramp, or seizures, or hemiplegia, where they can't move and they're completely paralyzed. And those symptoms of their 10 different symptom types are the ones that are most important to patients. So how can we evaluate when we look at our mouse models? The mice have this similar range of symptoms. They have a problem walking, but they also have these paroxysmal symptoms, is what they're called, when they have these storms of fleeting symptoms that are very severe. So we can prioritize evaluating those symptoms in mice that matter most to patients. Will a new therapy help the symptoms that matter most to patients, or will it just help the mice walk better, right? Like there are ways that we can insert priorities of our patient community. Now that we understand them well and can represent them well, we can insert them at every step along the way. And I think, so that piece is really important. But I think the other piece too is we can be treated as peers because we are adding value. We aren't just advocating for how important it is to study this condition or to study rare conditions generally. And, and that's part of what we do. We can make a case on the Hill, or we can be in that advocacy world. But for me, advocacy is kind of a very poor word for what I'm doing. What I'm trying to do is connect people. I'm finding someone with new expertise and bringing them into the team. I am thinking about biomarkers that we can develop so that when we do have this therapy at the finish line and we're thinking about a clinical trial, we can have some other markers of success, right? Like, so I'm thinking ahead to all of these other pieces, new animal models, new cellular models to evaluate how well a therapy is working. I'm bringing all of these pieces in that are complementary pieces, and I'm building teams and connecting people. And I think that's the piece. That is where I am adding value to scientists such that, we can be peers and partners and work together really well.
Yeah, I love that. That is such a beautiful thing. Nina, if you would tell us a little bit about Annabel. How is she doing? How old is she today?
So Annabelle just turned 10. We
Oh,
had a lovely little birthday party at our house with, it was a spa party. So we had little, face masks and various treatments. And she had her big sister and some of her big sister's friends doing, nails and makeup for these little girls in her class, which was wonderful.
yeah.
Everyone asks me how Annabelle's doing. And I always say, oh, she's doing great. And I say that to everyone. I mean, it's easier for me to say that she's doing great. And in
Mm,
many ways, my context is different. Um, I have friends who have lost children,
mm,
and I have friends who have, children who are suffering worse than Annabelle. Friends whose children I'm profoundly worried about. And there is a threat to their lives that hangs over them. Annabelle has symptoms. Annabelle is disabled. Annabelle has a lot of challenges, but she's happy and she's silly and she's a joy for us to have in our lives. I think we feel very lucky to have her.
yeah.
She could
You mentioned your older daughter. Maybe talk a little bit about how your experience with Annabelle and having a sister who has very significant special needs. Maybe talk a little bit about how that's affected your family and how your older daughter has adapted and adjusted to the challenges that you all have faced as a family.
So, it is a completely all-encompassing experience to have a child with a very serious medical condition. It is it is a challenge for all of us, and it kind of induces a lot of guilt for us as parents with,
Sure.
the sibling. And I think this is something that our friends in this world all grapple with. How can we make sure that we are spreading our time and attention and energy and making sure that the older child who's witnessing all of this trauma that's so hard for us as adults, how can we make sure that she is cared for? And it's a challenge. It's not something I figured out. And particularly for me, as a, obsessive workaholic, I've got that guilt. Then I've got the guilt of you know, the child who needs help walking up and down the stairs, the child who can't eat on her own, the child who needs my physical presence or someone's physical presence at all times. And what does that do when my older daughter is wanting to have a conversation with me about something that she finds important? But, there are all these other kind of more urgent medical needs that are
Right.
present at that same moment. It is
Yeah.
not something I have figured out yet. It is much more of a source of guilt and uncertainty and
Yeah.
difficulty.
Yeah, I can't begin to imagine. Do you have advice maybe for others or anything that while maybe you don't think you've figured it out, my guess is you're navigating this and you're probably along the way you're finding things that have been helpful to you and your family going forward. Maybe advice for somebody who's just starting a journey like this and could use advice and guidance or even just perspective on resilience. How do you continue to put one foot in front of the other when the world is really overwhelming? These are incredibly overwhelming things that you're dealing with. Maybe advice along any of those lines.
I think juggling the things, I think I have learned to give myself a whole lot of grace for the chaos that is elsewhere in my life. If
Mm,
my house is untidy, it would have bothered me so much 10 years ago. And now it's not something that registers for me.
yeah.
So I have tried to take the space that I have available and the space that's not spent working. So we're talking not much space, to be honest,
Right.
but the sense of what's important has changed quite significantly. And, my experience with resilience, it's a very extreme and kind of different place. I don't have the luxury of thinking about not continuing with what I'm doing. I simply don't. When there are days that are difficult, there was a day earlier this year, I was organizing a meeting in Australia with scientists and families, and I was communicating with a mom and asked her, going back and forth on email about various logistics. And she emailed me back and she said, I'm not going to be able to get back to you for a couple hours because I'm afraid Vivian has just died. How do I, this
Oh, wow.
woman, this is our world. Our world is not,
Ugh.
this is not a world that other people inhabit. This is a world of trauma, of loss, of
Mm,
grappling with things that are
mm,
not things that people should be dealing with. And so this wonderful mother is still trying to help advance what we are doing in the face of this, and in the face of this unimaginable circumstance. And she is still, even now after her daughter's passing, she's flying to DC to be here at our next event in the cathedral, because there is something that is, to be able to contribute to something impactful, I think is the only way that we, as parents of children with severe health issues that are, life-threatening and could be very serious indeed. I think that's the only way that we cope. So our resilience, it's very difficult because we don't really have an option.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I am obsessive about working and about, if I'm not thinking of the next thing to expand into, if I'm not thinking about the next gap to fill, if I'm not thinking of the next partner to enlist in what we're doing, there isn't anyone else doing it. I've got this wonderful team of people who work with me. So but that's kind of my role, is we're all doing really important things and we're all doing our very best, but we can't stop, I think. And that's the difficulty.
Yeah. For anyone listening to this conversation, Nina, what do you want them to take away from the conversation? What do you want them to know about your work, or maybe, advice that you would think that people would benefit from, someone who's dealing with something that is truly unimaginable? What do you want our audience to take away from this today?
So, a couple things. First, I think people should care about what I'm doing. I think that rare disease isn't rare. I think that's something that we've, kind of labeled ourselves into a corner. We're talking about 30 million people in the US. We're talking about really serious statistics where 30% of children diagnosed with a rare disease won't live to see their 5th birthday. We're talking about a situation where 6 or 7 children with a rare disease will die for every child that dies of pediatric cancer. This is a really, really big problem. And we call it rare disease, and there are often individual genes that are mutated that cause these diseases. And that does kind of separate things, but it also provides us this ability to understand genetics in a different way. And if we are combining the insights of all of these different genetic conditions, it really does offer us a way to think about genetics and about kind of the human genome and what that looks like in a more holistic way. So there's this huge amount of opportunity. There's also this huge amount of innovation that's happening in rare disease where, the risk profile is really quite different, where patients and their families and their physicians are willing to take a lot of risks to try new therapies. And there are therapies that are designed and tried in this population that, then have meaning for the rest of us. So I think that's rare disease. We shouldn't think of it as rare disease. We should think of it as a genetic underpinning for disease, and advancing research to better understand that genetic underpinning and to develop interventions understanding that genetic underpinning. I think that's critical for everyone. So that's one thing that I would say. But I would also say that I am profoundly grateful to be where I am. I am profoundly grateful to have this second world. And it's so profound that I often feel something of an imposter when I'm kind of going through my expected life, where I have children in schools, and they go to the same school that I went to as a child, and the community that I live in Washington, D.C. is this wonderful, sophisticated, this community well, right? Like, this is a wonderful world, but I don't necessarily feel comfortable here because I also have this other world, and it is my rare disease family of patients and their family members who are experiencing the same trauma and the same joy, and who have this very different life that I would never I would never have imagined that I'd be part of, but I am part of it, and it is rich and it's beautiful, and I am grateful to be a part of it.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. How can people find you if they would like to learn more about your work or maybe get involved? I know you have your big event that's coming up in just a few short weeks. Maybe tell people where they can find you.
Sure. So our website is rare-hope.org. we're actually having some challenges getting it visible on the internet because Selena Gomez's company. This is kind of odd, but
No
she
kidding.
has a company called Rare Beauty, and so when you type in Rare Hope in Google, all of their advertising like dwarfs us. So it's actually I will repeat the website because of this. Otherwise, we might be quite difficult to find. Rare-hope.org is the website,
Okay.
and I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on I'm on Instagram as Rare Hope. Well, there's a zero. That one's kind of difficult to say off the top of my head because one of my O's is a zero, and I'm not sure which one. But
I
so
will. I'll track that down, and we'll include that in the show notes so that folks can have that. Nina, thank you so much. I am so grateful, and I so appreciate the work that you're doing, and appreciate you spending the time with us today. And we wish you and your family and sweet Annabel all the best.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I enjoyed talking to you.